Hello, my name is Yura and welcome to another Baldur's Gate 3 build video. In today's video, I'd like to show you my Arcane Archer build, which will be a Fighter Ranger multiclass, which is of course going to focus primarily on shooting with your bow or crossbow at your enemies with the magical arrows, and on top of that we'll be able to cast, for example, Hunter's Mark for a little bit of extra damage, or even Ensnaring Strike to pin our enemies in place and gain advantage against them. So we'll have quite decent versatility with this character throughout the entire game. So let's get into the character creation. So for our race, I've chosen a high elf or a high half elf. It's completely up to you which one you want to choose, or if you in any other race you want, it is completely up to you. But I chosen a half elf variant or a high half elf, even if you go with that, because we gain a free cantrip with them. And the high elf cantrips are usually from the wizard pool, and of course they scale with intelligence. Now, we won't necessarily want to use any of the offensive cantrips because we are going to primarily be using our bow anyway. And I think the Friends cantrip is a quite great choice here because it can give you advantage in charisma checks against non-hostile creatures. So you get basically boosted dialogues outside of combat, or you just have to make sure that if you are done talking to a character, you leave the area before the timer runs out, or if you stop concentrating on it, because that character will accuse you of enchanting them and they will call the guards on you. So just keep that in mind. Now, what the half elves give us is we gain the civil militia. So this is going to give us proficiency with our light armor and shields. This is pretty good because this, if you are, for example, a spellcaster, you can get free 2 extra armor class with this, which is pretty nice. Now, weapon proficiency we don't really care about, especially we're fighters, so we have everything. We get dark vision of 40 feet, which is pretty nice, and we also get the Fey ancestry, which gives us advantage in the saving throws against being charmed, and we can't be put to sleep by magic, which is quite good. And of course, the standard racial speed. Now, of course, we are a high half elf, so we get that cantrip as we mentioned earlier. We're going to be starting off with a as a fighter, which is going to give us the second wind feature, which is a 1d10 plus fighter level heal, which is pretty nice. It can be quite handy, especially if you don't have any potions on hand or if you just want to use it. It's a decent little heal to have. For the fighting style, we're going to be going as archery, because this is going to give us a +2 to range attacks, so we have a greater chance of hitting with our range attacks. For the background, I went with the Guild Artisan. That's just my favorite background to pick. You can go with any other background you may prefer. It's completely up to you. But Guild Artisan gives us the insight and persuasion skills, which are both pretty useful, and they come up quite often. For the abilities, we're going with 17 Dexterity, 14 Constitution, 16 Wisdom, and 10 Charisma. For 17 Dexterity is of course self-explanatory. We are basically a range-focused character, and we want to have as high Dexterity as possible, which is going to give us basically higher hit chance and also high armor class if we use light or medium armors, especially some of the legion armors which do not have the usual medium armor cap of +2. For the constitution, we are a fighter, so we have proficiency in constitution saving throws, so we do not need this to be ridiculously high. We also have quite decent HP anyway. We won't be really focusing on that many important spells. Now, of course, Hunter's Mark is a relatively cheap spell since it's only a level 1, so we'll have quite a decent amount of spells, regardless if this is not 16. Now, Wisdom 16 here is quite strange, of course, you would think, because a Arcane Archer is naturally an intelligence-based spellcaster because he is within a fighter skill tree, or a fighter sort of like a subclass, or under a fighter tree, since fighters naturally are intelligence-based casters. But we're going to be getting a circlet which gives us 17 intelligence, so we can just skip intelligence here, and we can focus on our second levels, or our last 4 levels, where we're going to be getting our ranger levels to help our ranger have higher spell save DC with the, for example, ensnaring strike, and on top of that, it's going to help us with the wisdom saving throws. So we're going with 16 wisdom here, and then 10 charisma. You can choose if you want to have 10 charisma if this is your main face of the party, or you can go with, for example, 10 strength, so you can carry around more special arrows or poisons and coatings for your weapon. So it's up to you. I'm gonna go with charisma in this example. Now for the skills, we have quite a few choices here. So perception is great. Perception is, I think, a must-have on every character that can have it. It's a very useful one. It pops up quite often, and yeah, we're gonna be picking perception here. Now for the second point, it's up to you. History and animal handling, I wouldn't really take a look at. It's not really too useful. It doesn't pop too much. You could have survival on one character in your party, although it's not 100% necessary, since you can just use a dig action on a buried chest. If you know where it is roughly, you can just use a dig action around that area and you will just dig it up without actually, if you even fail the survival checks. Intimidation we don't need because we have persuasion, and persuasion pops up more often, although you could if you wish. but we're gonna go with athletics because athletics is quite nice. It gives us helps us shove and resist being shoved, and we already have +3 on acrobatics, so we don't really need acrobatics there. All right, so level 2 we get our action surge, and we can move on to level 3. At level 3 we get our subclass, and of course we're going to be sticking here with the Arcane Archer. This is going to give us 1 cantrip. It's a tool cantrip basically, so if you don't have a cleric you could pick up guidance, which is guidance is quite important, especially if well, outside of combat, mostly in dialogues and other skill checks. But if you do already have one, just pick up light. Light is going to give you a much easier time around in Act 2, which is pretty important. True Strike I would just skip because you don't really need it. Now for the Arcane Shot, all of these are almost redundant because the Shadow Arrow exists, and Shadow Arrow is ridiculously powerful. Basically what it does is it deals additional 2d6 psychic damage, and if the target fails the saving throw, they're blinded for 2 turns, and because they're blinded they will have you will have advantage on attack rolls against them. So this is a must pick up one, honestly, because it just allows you to dish out so much damage against the targets when they're blinded, of course. And it's going to give you basically advantage on them, so you can then use your sharpshooter against them on top of that. Then for the other arrows that I like to pick up, one of them is the Arcane Shot. This is just sort of like the flare one. Basically it's an arrow that deals AoE damage around the target you pick, and it deals 2d6 force damage around that target. I like to use this just if there is a big group of enemies around one area, and then I just shoot this to deal a lot of damage to them. Yeah, that's about it. But honestly, most of the time, Shadow Arrow and Arcane Shot. Well, these are Arcane Shot, but the Shadow Arrow is the one you're going to be using the most out of all of these, pretty much. Then the one that we have also here is the Arcane Shot Seeking Arrow. Now this is an arrow that deals 1d6 force damage and possibly inflicts fairy fire, but also this arrow always hits the target. So this is, you can think of it as almost a how do you call it, magic missile type of arrow. So this is a great arrow for finishing off low health enemies, so that you don't gamble on whether you miss them like 5 times in a row or not. So this is a pretty useful one as well. I would say this is probably the second most useful one, because it can guarantee you get the kill. And we can win. At level 4 we get our first feat, and here we're going to be taking dexterity +2, so ability improvement into dexterity. This is going to get it to 19. Now, either at this point or level 5, you can go and deal with anti-ethel, which then is going to give you another +1 into dexterity, which I would suggest. And it's going to round up the dexterity to a nice 20. So it's going to give us greater proficiency or effectiveness with our ranged weapons. And, of course, higher armor class if you're using light armor or medium armor doesn't have a armor class cap. Then at Act 3, you can get another +2 in dexterity, so we can round it up to a very nice 22 dexterity, which is going to be the end goal of the dexterity cap we're looking for with this character. At level 5, we get our extra attack. Now, we can replace our Arcane Arrows with every level, but we don't really need to. At level 6, we gain our second feat, and here we're gonna go for the Sharpshooter, of course. Sharpshooter being an amazing feat to have on all of the ranged characters. Basically what it does is your ranged attacks do not receive penalties from high ground. And on top of that, ranged weapon attacks with weapons we are proficient with gain a -5 penalty to their attack roll, but they deal 10 additional damage. This can be toggled on or off, which is great if you are attacking somebody with high armor class. You can just turn this off, or if you have advantage against them, you can turn it on and deal extra 10 damage, which is quite amazing. At level 7, we gain some surplus features. For example, we of course gain additional Arcane Arrows. We gain the Magic Arrow, so all of our ranged attacks are considered magical to overcome resistance, which is pretty nice. And we gain the Curving Shot. When we miss a target with a ranged attack, which is a magical ranged attack, we can use a bonus action so that we attack the next closest target with the same attack. So essentially, the arrow just curves from the initial target you missed onto a different target, and it might hit them and apply the effect of, let's say, the Shadow Arrow, which might blind them. Then for the Arcane Shot, we get to pick one more one, and that's going to be it for this character. Now, the one I would suggest taking would be possibly the Banishing Arrow. This one can be nice if you hit a dangerous target with and you banish them for 2 turns, so they are out of the fight for those 2 turns, which is the one I'll be going for. Now, the rest of these, Beguiling Arrow is like the Shadow Arrow, deals 2d6 psychic damage, and if the enemy fails the saving throw, they become charmed. Now, Charm is not that great because what it does here is the target can attack the spellcaster, and the spell has an advantage on charisma checks in dialogue. So the it doesn't have the same effect of, let's say, control person or control monster, or I think it's called the one that lets you control divine beings like the divas and so on. Anyway, I forget the name of the spell. It's not the same effect with that, so it's not that great. You would mostly use this for the extra damage, but you already have Shadow Arrow for that. Then the Feebling Arrow is 2d6 necrotic damage, and if they fail the saving throw, they become enfeebled, so their weapons deal only half damage. Again, useful, but if you blind them, they have disadvantage, so they have a lower chance of hitting you anyway. And then the Grasping Arrow, this is essentially just Hunter's Mark. It deals 2d6 poison damage, and then their entity's movement speed is reduced by 10 feet, and it will take 2d6 slashing damage when it moves. It's almost like Hunter's Mark. Not Hunter's Mark, the Ensnaring Strike. It's almost like a Ensnaring Strike, just prevents the target from moving at all, and then as for every turn they're ensnared, they take bludgeoning damage. This one just deals slashing damage when they move. So yeah, it's similar, but not exactly the same. And then lastly, the Arcane Shot Piercing Arrow. Use the transmutation magic to attack all those within the line of your shot. Each target must succeed a 6 saving throw or be dealt 1d6 piercing damage. This is basically just I would say, a weaker version of the one that we have, the AoE, the Exploding Arrow, that deals 1d6 force damage to everybody in an AoE. So we're going with the Banishing Arrow. At level 8, we gain our third and not last, but third last fighter feat. And we're going to take in Alert. Alert is great. It gives you +5 to initiative, and you can be surprised. You want this because you want to be first one in the initiative so that you can start blinding targets with your arrows, or possibly even ensnaring them with your ensnaring shot. Now, we can't ensnare them yet, but we'll be able to do that soon. At level 9, we would get Indomitable, but we're going to start our multi-class into Ranger. So here, I was just going for a Bounty Hunter. It's going to give us proficiency in Investigation, which is quite useful, and also creatures that we hit with our Ensnaring Strike, range or melee, will have disadvantage on the save throw, so they will have a much less of a chance of actually succeeding to save on the Ensnaring Strike. Then for the Natural Explorer, I would suggest going for Fire. Fire is probably the most common damage type in the game, other than, of course, the standard Slashing, Bludgeoning, Piercing, so we're going to go with this. For the abilities, we have 1 point, and we can put it into Survival, Animal Handling, on Stealth. And out of all of these are all pretty bad, especially since we don't plan on stealthing with this character, because we'll have relatively low stealth roll. We might as well just put in Survival, or you could go with Stealth anyway. This one doesn't really matter, so I'll just put it into Survival, just so it's somewhere. Then at level 10, we unlock our spellcasting for the Ranger, and we're going to be taking, of course, the Hunter's Mark and the Ensnaring Strike. Hunter's Mark is great. It's going to give you a little bit of extra damage, and then the Ensnaring Strike is going to give you the ability to ensnare targets so that they cannot move. They take 1d6 piercing damage per turn, and you have advantage on attack rolls against them. Then for the second fighting style, we're going to be going for Defense. Defense is just great. It gives you +1 to armor class. You could potentially take Dueling, since we will be wielding a shield with this character, but I think Defense is also quite good of a choice here, so we're going to go with Defense. Then level 11, we get another spell slot, and here you can choose whichever one you want here. It honestly doesn't really matter too much. You won't be really using it, although you could use the Hand Slip outside of combat, which is going to triple your jumping distance for free, because this is considered a ritual spell outside of combat. So we're gonna be taking the Hand Slip in my case. Now for the subclass, I was just going for the Hunter. Hunter is great because it doesn't require heavy investment into its subclass, and it's gonna give you the Hunter Spray. And Colossal Slayer is great because it's essentially a second Hunter's Mark, where once per turn your weapon attacks deal additional 1d8 damage if the target is below its maximum hit points. So you can get an extra damage die on every target on your target every single turn, which is quite great. And then finally at level 12 we get our fourth and last feat, and here you have a choice. You could go Ability Deployment +2 into Wisdom, so your Wisdom saving throws have a higher spell save DC for example, Ensnaring Strike. Or you could also take, for example, Warcaster, so that you don't have to really worry about having to recast Hunter's Mark or similar, or the Ensnaring Strike that they're going to bring concentration before they escape it. But namely, you would probably want this for the Hunter's Mark. So it's up to you if you're going to go for the Warcaster or the Ability Improvement. I, in my example, went with Wisdom, so this is what I'm going to go with. But again, Warcaster is just a good choice as well. Alright, so that is it for the levels. I will now see you in the equipment section. Alright, so here we are in equipment section, so let's start with our headgear. Here we have the Warped Headband of Intellect. Since the wearer's intelligence is 17, the enchantment has no effects if their intelligence score is higher without it. So this is a great one because we can essentially, like I mentioned before, dump our intelligence, and we can wear this to get that +3 for the intelligence checks, and also it is going to give us a +3 to dispel save DC on our arcane arrows, which is quite handy. For the alternatives, I don't really have ones because I thought this was a great pick for it. For the cloak, I have here the Cloak of Displacement. At the beginning of the wearer's turn, the cloak activates, granting enemies disadvantage in attack rolls to target the wearer. This effect lasts until the wearer takes damage. Basically, it gives you the effects of Blur, which is pretty nice. Alternatively, as always, you could pick up the Cloak of Protection, armor class Senators +1. For the armor, we have the Armor of Agility. It adds our full dexterity modifier to the armor class, and it also does not impose disadvantage on stealth checks, which is pretty good. And we have +2 to saving throws, which is very good as well. For the alternatives, you could wear either versions of the adamantine armor. Splint being the better version because it's heavy armor and it gives basically just upgraded effects compared to the scale mail. So all incoming damage reduced by 2, enemies get set to railing for 3 turns after they hit you, and you have disadvantage on stealth checks, but also enemies can't land critical hits on the wearer. Basically, this is the same thing, but weaker. And then finally, you want the scale mail. Is essentially a weaker version of armor agility, same effect exotic material, but it gives you +1 to bonus to initiative rolls. So if you want higher initiative, you could pick up the UNT scale mail, and the armor class will be, I believe, around 2. Yeah, so it's not too much of a big deal. For the gloves, I went with the Legacy of the Masters, gain a +2 to attack rolls and damage rolls with weapons, so we have a greater hit chance with our ranged weapons, and we deal a little bit of extra damage as well. The early game version I was wearing was the Gloves of Archery. They almost do the same thing, except they don't give you +2 to the attack rolls, they just give you 2 additional damage with ranged weapon attacks. So I've been rolling with this. You could also wear either the Flawed Helldusk Gloves or the Dark Justiciar Gauntlets for the extra damage. So Flawed Helldusk Gloves going to give you the 1d4 fire damage, and then Dark Justiciar Gauntlets can give you 1d4 necrotic damage. Or you could wear the Bone Spike Gloves, which basically make all your attacks ignore slashing, piercing, and bludgeoning, unless the target is immune to it. And I think the most common attack that is resisted is the piercing damage. So, for example, all of these theater watchers have resistance to both magical and non-magical piercing damage, but slashing or bludgeoning they don't. So these are very nice gloves for dealing full damage as well, although it won't matter too much because we have the sharpshooter feet. For the boots, I went with the Boots of Speed. This gives us Click Heals ability, when basically it's a bonus action dash, as you can see here, and it's great for mobility, right? It's because you won't have too many uses for your bonus action other than either using a weapon coating or casting Hunter's Mark. Otherwise, you can just use this to move around the battlefield quite quickly. For the alternatives, you could use the Boots of Persistence, gives you the freedom of movement so you can't be crowd controlled into the same spot, and of course gives you a Long Strider, but generally I have Long Strider Spellcaster in all of my parties, so this isn't too useful, but having the freedom of movement is quite nice. And then of course, as always, the Disintegrate Nightwalkers. You can't be enwebbed, entangled, and snared, you can sleep on grease or ice, and you gain 1 Misty Step per short rest, which is pretty good. Then for our amulet, we're going with the Amulet of Misty Step. A great amulet because, like the Disintegrating Nightwalker boots, gives you Misty Step once per short rest, so it gives you a pretty good mobility spell that you can cast 3 times per long rest usually. Now for the alternatives, we have the Surgeon Subjugation Amulet. This is a great one because once per long rest, while going critical hit humanoid, you can paralyze the target for 2 turns, which is pretty nice against humanoid bosses. With this, I would suggest taking the Killer Sweetheart, because it has quite great synergy with it. Basically, when you kill a creature, your next attack roll will be critical hit, and of course, you can bank up that critical hit and use it with the amulet. Or if you use the Lithith power that grants you the critical hit as well, can work quite well with the amulet. And then for the other alternative, we have the Amulet of Devotion. Namely, you would potentially want this just so you can get the +2 to your spell save DC, so that the enemies have to roll a higher spell save DC for the Arcane Shot and the Ensnaring Strike. For the rings, I went with the Shadow Cloaked Ring. The wearer's weapon and armor attacks deal additional 1d4 damage against slightly or heavily obscured targets, increased rate of shadow. This is going to come up quite often because being obscured, enemies being obscured lightly is quite easy. They just need to be, for example, in the shadow of a building. So this is going to be a quite nice damage boost throughout the entire game. And then lastly, I took the Everset Ring. Now this is not necessary. You can use another ring, Kill Sweetheart, or the Acoustic Band, or the Strange Content Ring. All of these are good for extra damage because we'll be concentrating quite often since we will be using Hunter's Mark post level 10 or post level 9. So you could use this one, although otherwise you can use the Kusik Band, or like I mentioned earlier, you could use the Killer's Sweetheart with the Surgeon Subjugation Amulet. So it's up to you which combination of these rings you want to go with. For our weapons, we're going with the Knife on the Other Mountain King, mainly because it gives us a nice feature where it reduces our critical hit roll required by 1, so we now crit on a 19. This effect can stack, but we are not really focusing on stacking it. And it also gives us advantage on attack rolls against light to heavily obscure targets when using this blade. Now this fortunately has been fixed, so now the Shadow Blade feature of this dagger works, or well, it's technically a short sword, but it says it's a knife. But it actually works now, so that's quite good. And then for our shield, we're using the Catheric Shield, namely because it gives us +1 to spell save DC and attack rolls. It also gives us advantage on dexterity saving throws, which is pretty useful, and of course Shield Bash. For the alternatives, you could use, for example, the Adamantium Skin Eater. It's a pretty nice sword because it ignores resistances to the slashing damage, and it always crits if you hit an object with it. Alternatively, you could also use the Ambusher. It gives you +1 to initiative rolls and advantage on perception ability checks, which is pretty good. And on top of that, in combat, when you deal damage, in combat, you do extra 1d6 necrotic damage against creatures that haven't taken a turn yet. Generally, it's gonna be pretty much everyone because you'll always be first, and it's a nice damage combo if you use it, for example, with the Arrow of Many Targets, because then that's going to deal 1d6 necrotic damage extra to every single target that Arrow of Many Targets hits. Then for the shields, you could use the Sentinel Shield if you want even more initiative. You get also advantage of perception ability checks. A pretty nice shield, but not really necessary for this character, but it's still a nice pick. And then we have the Shield of Devotion. You gain +1 to your level 1 spell slots. You get Devotion Aid, which gives you 10 extra hit points until long rest. This only applies to you, not to your party, but still pretty good. Then for the ranged weapon, I went with the Gonter Mel. On hit, possibly inflict guiding bolt upon the target. Basically gives you advantage against that target. This weapon shines in a radius of 20 feet. It's enchantment +3, and it gives you Celestial Haste, so you can basically cast haste on yourself for 5 turns. And if either the effect ends or if you break concentration, it won't apply lethargic to you because this is essentially a much better version of the haste, although it lasts 5 turns less, or the effect is 5 turns shorter. Alternative for the early game, you could use the Herald or the Giant Breaker. Herald is great because it applies Bane on targets if they fail the saving throw, and then Herald applies Reeling on targets whenever you hit them, so then they have a penalty on the attack rolls every turn remaining of this effect. Then for the late game alternatives, you could use both the Banshee. Both the Banshee is quite nice because it inflicts fear, possibly inflicts fear on every attack, and then you gain a 1d4 bonus to attack rolls and damage against frightened creatures, so it gives you a little bit of extra damage with that. And then for the Act 3 alternatives, you could use the Hellrider Longbow. Hellrider Longbow is actually quite nice for ranged characters, because once per turn, a creature hit by this weapon will possibly afflicted with Fairy Fire. And what this means is, for the rest of that turn, all of you or your allies will have advantage against that target, which is a better effect than Guiding Bolt, but Gonter Mel is a +3 enchantment weapon, so it has a naturally higher damage and higher chance to hit. But again, this is a nice one for the Fairy Fire effect. And on top of that, you gain the initiative bonus, so +3, and advantage on perception ability checks. And finally, of course, any ranged weapon build can benefit from Deadshot. It gives us improved critical, so number we need to roll to critically hit while attacking is by 1, so we would crit on an 18 with this. But it doubles the proficiency with this weapon when we roll ranged attacks with this weapon unless they have disadvantage. So essentially, instead of a +4 to hit, we get a +8 with this at level 12. And it's a +2. And finally, for some of the elixir, we have the Elixir of Colossus. This is a great one for ranged characters because it gives us additional 1d4 damage. It just says weapons deal additional 1d4 damage, not necessarily just melee weapons. So this does work with ranged weapons. Alright, so that is it for the equipment. I will now see you in the combat showcase. Alright, so here we are at Flaming Fists Barracks for Eternal Ball Showcase. Now, before combat started, I did use the Elixir of Colossus and the Celestial Haste, although I shouldn't have really cast Celestial Haste because we will be using Hunter's Mark, but that's fine since we won't be lethargic anyway. So, before we begin, let's use Brace, so that then this is basically Savage Attacker, but for ranged weapons. With some ranged weapons get this. Basically, when you roll range damage, you roll the die twice and use the highest result. So So let's take a look at the damage. We'll be turning off the sharpshooter just for the sake of the showcase so that we have a higher chance of hitting, because we can just add a +10 to all the damage rolls if we want the sharpshooter damage to be applied. So we managed to actually hit him. And if we take a look, we dealt 20 damage, which was a 5 from, 5 from the body secret, which got rerolled. 8 from the dexterity modifier and the weapons enchantment, 1 from the elixir of Colossus, so it does apply to range attacks, 2 from Mark Gloves, which is the arming enchantment, and then a 1d4 from the Shadow Thief, which was the ring, as all of these guys are considered to be obscured because they are in the Shadow building, although I don't know why this area here is not considered obscured. There was a bit of an area here that wasn't anyway. Now, let's apply Hunter's Mark on him. Colossus applied to him for some reason. I'm not sure. He was full HP, so I don't know why it applied. But anyway, doesn't matter. Let's just shoot him again. And this time, we dealt slightly more damage. So we dealt basically 1 damage less without the Colossal Slayer because of Hunter's Mark. Basically, it applied 1d6, right? Normally, your first attack would just deal your normal weapon damage, and then you would deal additional 2d6 damage to this guy after you apply Hunter's Mark and the Ghost Slayer. Of course, if we applied it immediately, we would deal Hunter's Mark in the first attack, and then we would, in the second attack, we would deal Hunter's Mark and Ghost Slayer. Now they just got split up. So essentially, the damage we're looking at would be 36 and 35 if you apply the Sharpshooter all-in. And we can, for example, just do our Arcane shot on this wizard here with Sharpshooter all-in to deal, what is this, 39 damage total. So we have quite decent damage with this character. We could also just use the bursting arrow to blow them all up. Now, unfortunately, we missed, but also I was going to say, unfortunately, the Sharpshooter all-in does not apply to the force damage, so it just 2d6 force damage the entire time. But I think it's still useful to use this on a big group of enemies, even in the late game, because you end up dealing quite a lot of damage to all of them. So there we go. Alright, so that is it for the build. I hope you enjoyed. I would appreciate if you'll leave a like, subscribe, and comment for more Baldur's Gate 3 content, and I'll see you in the next one.